In the early hours before dawn, when Hollywood still slept behind its gates and palm-lined streets, Dean Martin often found himself awake. Seated alone at a small table near a window, coffee untouched, cigarette unlit, watching the sky change color like a slow confession. Fame had given him everything people imagined they wanted: recognition, wealth, access, invitations into rooms where decisions were made, yet it had also wrapped him in a quieter, heavier reality, the unspoken rules. Who could speak? Who couldn't? Which stories were permitted? Which ones were buried? Dean had learned those rules not from contracts, but from what happened to the men who broke them. Careers didn't always end with explosions. More often, they faded. Phones stopped ringing. Invitations vanished. Names drifted into the past tense. And on this particular morning, Dean was about to be reminded exactly where the lines were drawn. The call came just after 6. Polite voice, professional tone, a request framed as a courtesy. There had been an incident on a studio lot the night before, nothing violent, nothing dramatic enough to make headlines, but serious enough to make powerful people nervous. A young supporting actor, barely known, had spoken out during a rehearsal after a producer humiliated a crew member in front of the entire soundstage. The boy hadn't shouted. He hadn't insulted anyone. He'd simply said, "That's not right." Simple words. Dangerous words. By morning, he'd been told his contract was under review. By noon, he would likely be gone. And now, several executives wanted Dean Martin's help to smooth things over. They didn't ask him to lie. They asked him to stay quiet, to release a harmless statement, to call it a misunderstanding, to protect the atmosphere. The machine would handle the rest. Dean didn't answer right away. He listened. He always listened. That was something people underestimated about him. They mistook his warmth for softness, his humor for distance, his calm for indifference. But Dean Martin heard tone. He heard what was said and what was avoided. And in that careful, respectful request, he heard fear. Not fear of the truth, fear of disruption. Fear that one small voice left uncorrected could remind others that they had one too. By 8 o'clock, he was on the studio lot, not because he had to be, but because he wanted to see the place before it rearranged itself. The lot was already awake, alive with cables. Carts, scripts, and coffee cups, all moving with the illusion of chaos while obeying a hidden order. People smiled when they saw him. Some bowed their heads slightly. Others relaxed. Dean had that effect. He made rooms feel safer, and that was precisely why he'd been called. Safety was the image they needed. Silence was the price they expected. He found the young actor sitting, alone near a painted backdrop of a city street that would never exist. The boy's name was Ethan, 22. First studio contract. Still carried his own jacket. Still thanked assistants for water. Still believed that respect traveled both directions. Ethan stood when he saw Dean, startled, embarrassed, unsure whether he was about to be helped or erased. Dean motioned for him to sit and did the same. Not as a star lowering himself, but as a man choosing the same ground. Ethan spoke quickly, as people do when they think time is already against them. He explained what happened. How the producer had torn into a lighting assistant for a delay the assistant hadn't caused. How everyone had looked away. How something in him had tightened, then broken. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said. It didn't feel human to pretend nothing happened. Dean didn't interrupt. He studied the boy's face. Not for innocence, for alignment. And he saw it. The quiet steadiness beneath the nerves. The thing that couldn't be coached. When Ethan finished, he waited for the verdict. Dean didn't give one. He asked a question instead. "If they weren't powerful," he said gently, "would you still think you were wrong?" Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. Dean nodded once. That was enough. At 10, Dean entered a conference room that had decided more futures than it ever acknowledged. The men inside stood to greet him. Compliments followed. Memories. Laughter. Comfort. Then the tone shifted, as it always did when business stepped forward. They explained the situation as if he hadn't already seen it. They spoke of investments, of schedules, of unnecessary friction, of how one voice could complicate hundreds of jobs, of how he, Dean Martin, understood the responsibility of influence. They never said the word silence, didn't need to. It lived between their sentences. They offered him a statement. Carefully written, neutral, gentle. Dean read it slowly. It praised professionalism, expressed regret for any misunderstanding, emphasized unity. Not one line was false, and not one line was true. He placed the paper back on the table, folding it once, precisely like someone returning a borrowed object. "You don't want me to protect a person," he said. "You want me to protect a system?" One of the executives smiled as if Dean had made a joke. Another leaned back, confident. "Dean," he said, "systems are what protect people." Dean didn't raise his voice. He never did when it mattered. "No," he replied. "People protect people. Systems protect themselves." The room changed then, not visibly, but perceptibly, the way pressure changes before a storm. They reminded him of everything at stake, of loyalty, of gratitude, of how many careers depended on stability. They spoke as if stability were the same as dignity, as if calm and justice were interchangeable. Dean listened, hands folded, eyes attentive, not as a man being warned, but as one deciding whether the warning deserved obedience. He stood when they finished. He thanked them for their time. He said he would make his own statement. Outside, the lot buzzed. Somewhere, someone laughed. Somewhere else, a set was being built, already pretending it would last. Dean walked past it all, not toward his car, but toward the small platform near the rehearsal stage where public remarks were sometimes made when studios wanted warmth and cameras were close enough to hear it. A few people noticed him change direction. Word traveled quickly when power moved unexpectedly. By the time he reached the platform, there were assistants, publicists, crew members, lingering under the professional disguise of coincidence. Someone asked if he wanted his prepared remarks. Dean shook his head. He stepped up, hands resting lightly at his sides, posture relaxed, expression calm. No anger, no performance. Just presence. The kind that comes when a man is finished negotiating with himself. "I was asked this morning," he began, voice steady, to help quiet something down. Heads tilted, pens lifted. Not because it was untrue, because it was uncomfortable. He paused, letting the distinction land. There's a difference between noise and disruption. Noise fades. Disruption changes direction. People drew closer. Some from curiosity, some from instinct, some because something in his tone told them this wasn't promotional. "I met a young man today," Dean continued. "He saw someone treated without dignity and he said so. That's it. No insults. No spectacle. Just a line he didn't step over." He glanced across the crowd, not seeking agreement, but acknowledging witnesses. If that ends a career, then it wasn't a career. It was a lease, and it can be revoked any time silence is more valuable than character. Murmurs rippled. Somewhere behind him, a studio representative stiffened. "I've been in this town a long time," Dean said. "Long enough to know how many people were told the same thing I was told today. Don't make it complicated. Don't risk it. Don't be the one." He allowed a faint, sad smile. "But every good thing that ever happened here started with someone being the one." He didn't name the producer. He didn't attack the studio. He didn't dramatize the incident. He did something far more dangerous. He reframed it. "If you punish decency," he said, "you don't get professionalism. You get fear. And fear looks quiet, but it's expensive. It costs you your best people first." Then he stepped down. No crescendo. No applause cue. Just movement, conversations, phones, a subtle, spreading realization that something had been set in motion that could not be folded and placed back on a table. From a distance, Ethan watched, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. Dean caught his eye for a moment and nodded once. Not in reassurance. In recognition, within hours, the story would fracture into versions. Studio memos, industry whispers, articles that tried to soften the edges. But something irreversible had already happened. The machine had expected Dean Martin to lend his warmth to silence. Instead, he had given it to a line, and lines once drawn publicly have a way of demanding witnesses choose where they stand. The first thing that changed was not visible. It was not a headline or a phone call or a confrontation. It was space. The subtle absence of warmth in rooms that once leaned toward him. The delay before greetings. The way laughter now arrived half a second late, as if people were checking permission before allowing it to exist. Dean Martin noticed these things not because he feared them, but because he had spent a lifetime learning the language of environments. Hollywood spoke before it shouted, and this morning it was speaking in pauses. By noon, the lot felt reorganized around him. He walked through it the same way he always hadn't hurried, acknowledging grips and assistants, exchanging small comments with wardrobe women and sound technicians, but the current had shifted. Some faces lit up with quiet gratitude. Others looked away too quickly. People had begun to sort themselves, not into supporters and opponents, but into those who could afford to be seen and those who could not. That was the real fracture line. Courage was never evenly distributed. Consequence always was. Dean was halfway through a rehearsal when his agent arrived unannounced.
How?
Breath held too tightly for a casual visit. The man waited until the room cleared, until the echo of movement faded into the architecture, before speaking. He didn't scold. He didn't threaten. He did something worse. He brought numbers. 3 studios had paused negotiations. A sponsor had requested distance. A variety special that had been in formal certainty for weeks was now under reconsideration.
Oh.
None of it was framed as punishment. Everything was framed as timing, atmosphere, alignment, the vocabulary of polite retreat. Dean listened, his hands folded, expression thoughtful, as if they were discussing a set change. When the agent finished, he added, almost apologetically, "They're not angry. They're just alert." Dean nodded. "So am I." The agent hesitated. "Dean, this doesn't need to become a thing." A second statement. Something about unity. About moving forward. "You don't have to walk this into a storm." Dean stood, crossed to the window, and looked out at a painted skyline waiting to be real. "Storms don't happen because someone walks into them," he said quietly. "They happen because pressure stops being patient." By mid-afternoon, the whispers had matured into a narrative. Not hostile, not overt. Just reframed. Dean Martin wasn't being courageous. He was being emotional. He wasn't principled. He was being impulsive. He wasn't defending dignity. He was complicating a delicate ecosystem. That phrase appeared twice in different mouths within the same hour, which meant it had already been printed somewhere people weren't meant to see. He felt it most sharply, not from executives, but from peers. An old friend passed him in a corridor, smiled, squeezed his arm, and said, "Careful. Dino, town's got a short memory and a long shadow." Another invited him to dinner, then canceled 30 minutes later with a message that tried too hard to sound casual. A third left a note on his dressing room mirror. "Proud of you. Can't say that out loud yet." Dean stared at it longer than he expected to. The hardest moment came near evening. He was leaving the soundstage when he saw Ethan at the far end of the lot, surrounded by 3 men who were not shouting, not touching him, not causing a scene end, yet everything about the shape of the moment said confrontation. Dean changed direction without announcing it. By the time he reached them, one of the men had finished speaking. Ethan's shoulders were squared, but his face had that particular stillness people wear when they are being cornered politely. One of the men turned when he saw Dean and immediately rearranged his expression into respect. "We were just clarifying expectations," he said. Dean looked at Ethan. "What expectations?" The man answered instead. "That public commentary has ripple effects, and that those ripples don't always land where people intend."
Howdy.
Dean nodded once. "That's true." The man seemed relieved. "Exactly. So it's best if we all proceed thoughtfully." Dean's voice didn't change. "You're not talking to we. You're talking to him." Thin pause. We're talking about professionalism. Dean stepped closer, not aggressively, not challengingly, simply into alignment. No, he said. You're talking about obedience? And you're wrapping it in professionalism, so it doesn't have to admit what it costs. Silence, then. The men excused themselves with practiced efficiency. Ethan exhaled only after they were gone. They said I might still have a chance, he said, if I kept my head down. Dean studied him. And what did you hear? Ethan swallowed. That I might still have a job? If I stopped being myself. Dean rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. Then what they offered you wasn't a job. It was a disguise. Ethan's eyes lifted. What if I can't afford not to wear it? The question landed heavier than any threat. Because it was honest. Because it wasn't dramatic. Because it was the question that had bent more backs than any tyrant ever had. Dean didn't answer quickly. He walked with him instead, slow steps along the edge of the lot where the glamour thinned and the infrastructure showed. There are seasons, he said, where survival is not cowardice, where protecting your future is not betrayal. But there is a difference between bending and shrinking. One lets you stand again. The other teaches the world the size it can keep you. Ethan looked ahead. How do you know which one you're doing? Dean stopped. Turned to him fully. You don't. Not at first. You only know whether you're growing heavier or clearer. Pay attention to that. They parted there. By nightfall, the first article dropped. It was subtle. Impressive, even, in its restraint. It praised Dean's legendary warmth. His contribution to the industry, his likability, then it pivoted just slightly toward concern. Toward whether icons should involve themselves in personnel matters. Toward whether comments, however well-intended, could destabilize complex production ecosystems. It quoted unnamed insiders. It balanced admiration with unease. It gave everyone permission to feel supportive and uncomfortable at the same time. This was how reputations were not. Destroyed but repositioned. Dean read it once. Then again, not for anger. For information, he folded the paper and set it aside. Not unlike the statement from the morning before, his phone rang well past 10. The voice on the other end was not studio, not press, not management. It belonged to a woman named Clara Reyes. She had started as a script supervisor, worked her way into production, quietly, relentlessly. She now oversaw 2 mid-tier projects and had spent her career learning which rooms to leave before the doors closed. I wasn't supposed to call you, she said, and I'm not supposed to say this, but things are moving. Dean listened. They're looking for a way to make an example without making you the example, she continued. And the way you do that is not by punishing the mountain. It's by burying the ground beneath it. What does that mean? Dean asked. It means they're not done with the boy, she said. And they're not done with anyone who looks like him. They're building a narrative. About instability. About liability. About difficult environments. Once that's set, people won't need to be told to stay quiet. They'll volunteer. Dean closed his eyes briefly, not in despair. In recalibration, why are you telling me this? He asked. There was a long pause. Because 20 years ago, she said, someone spoke when they didn't have to, and it kept me here long enough to become someone who can see what's coming. I don't know what you're about to do, but if it's loud, make it accurate. The line went dead. Dean sat alone in the quiet that followed. Not theatrical quiet, but the kind that gathers weight. He thought of every career he had watched dissolve, not through scandal, but through strategic loneliness. He thought of the men who had warned him to be careful, of the notes that couldn't be spoken, of the machine's real genius. It didn't crush. It isolated. And isolation taught obedience faster than fear ever could. He stood, crossed to the mirror, and studied the face that had sold records, filled halls, softened rooms. He saw the warmth. He saw the age. He saw something else now, too, Anne, edged not of anger, but of definition. They had not asked him to lie. They had asked him to let a pattern survive, and patterns only change. When someone makes them visible, Dean reached for the phone, not to call his agent, not to call a studio, He called a reporter who had once lost access for refusing to print a softened truth. A woman who now worked on the margins and therefore saw the center more clearly than most. When she answered, Dean Martin said, "I'd like to tell you exactly what happened yesterday, and exactly what happened after." There was a breath on the other end. Then, on the record, Dean looked at his reflection one more time. "Yes," he said, "all of it." And in that single word, the situation crossed a line no studio could quietly erase. Because now, the story was no longer about a young actor. It was about how power teaches silence, and what happens when someone with nothing left to protect but meaning refuses the lesson. The article did not explode. It didn't need to. It moved the way pressure moves through steel silently, invisibly, until structure itself began to hum. By sunrise, it was everywhere that mattered and nowhere that could be easily blamed. It wasn't framed as an expose. It was written like a map. Calm. Methodical. Names placed beside behaviors. Timelines aligned. Contradictions allowed to reveal themselves without accusation. It included Dean's words in full, not polished, not dramatic, not softened. It also included what followed, the delayed contracts, the sudden reconsiderations, the conversations that were no longer being returned. For the first time, the industry was not being asked who was wrong. It was being asked how silence worked. Dean read it in a quiet kitchen while the city, outside, prepared itself for a normal day that no longer existed. He knew this article would not end him. That was not how the machine functioned. It would test him instead. It would test whether attention could be turned into discomfort and discomfort into retreat. It would wait to see if he would correct himself. The calls began mid-morning. Some were furious. Most were not. Most were frightened, one veteran producer told him. "Almost kindly, you force people to pick sides. Dino, they don't like that." Studio head left a message that contained no anger and no invitation, only the phrase, "We'll revisit some things once the air clears." A sponsor quietly informed his management that their brand was not aligned with public controversy. The language remained civilized. The effect was surgical, but something else was happening at the same time. People who had not been visible were becoming so. A wardrobe supervisor sent him a letter, handwritten in careful ink, thanking him for saying out loud what had lived unspoken in her department for 15 years. A cinematographer he barely knew stopped him on the lot, eyes wet, and said, "I stayed when I shouldn't have. I'm not doing that again." A casting assistant placed a note in his trailer that read only, "You didn't save one boy. You named the fire by afternoon." The fracture had become undeniable. A popular late-night host referenced the situation without using names, making a joke that landed wrong because the audience felt its proximity to truth. 2 young actors canceled press appearances. A director quietly withdrew from a panel titled "Professionalism in Modern Hollywood." The industry's favorite, shield normalcy was slipping, and then the real move came. It didn't come from the top, it came from the middle. A coalition of mid-level producers, people powerful enough to influence work, but not powerful enough to command it released. A statement condemning the politicization of internal matters. They spoke of danger, of destabilization, of the risk of letting emotion override process. They never mentioned Dean by name. They didn't have to. Within an hour, 3 projects under Dean's informal attachment were officially indefinitely postponed. Not canceled, suspended. The softest form of erasure. The kind that required no announcement and no reversal. His agent arrived again that evening, this time not carrying numbers, but carrying weight. "They're building a narrative," he said, "that you're unpredictable. That working with you introduces volatility. Not because you're wrong, but because you won't stay contained." He hesitated. "They want to know if you're willing to let this settle." Dean leaned back in his chair. "Settle where?" "Anywhere but forward," the man replied quietly. That night, Dean did something he hadn't done in years. He went to a small club on the east side of the city, where new performers tested their voices before they were sculpted. No press, no advance word. Just a man who loved music standing near the back wall. He watched a young woman freeze halfway through her first song, her voice catching not from nerves, but from something heavier. The pianist waited. The audience held. She closed her eyes, breathed, and began again softly at first, then stronger. Then, with a clarity that changed the air, Dean felt it in his chest. Not talent, permission. After her set, he found her near the bar, still trembling, still uncertain whether she had failed or survived. "Why did you stop?" he asked. She swallowed. "Because I suddenly realized everyone was listening. And then," he said, "and then I realized I still wanted to sing." Dean smiled. "That second part," he said. "That's the career." He left the club with something he hadn't felt since the morning the studio called him, direction, the next day. The ground shifted. Ethan's contract was officially terminated. The press release was immaculate, mutual, gracious, creative differences. The kind of ending that never happened to a person, only to a concept. Within minutes, commentators began speculating whether the young actor had been ready for a professional environment, whether emotional intelligence had been mistaken for insubordination, whether idealism was sustainable in an industry built on coordination. Dean didn't read those. He drove. He found Ethan in a small apartment packed too carefully, the way people pack when they believe they may have to do it again. The boy tried to apologize for being a problem, for causing waves, for costing people things. Dean raised a hand gently. "Stop," he said. "You didn't cost anyone anything. You revealed what they were already spending." Ethan's voice cracked. "Then why does it feel like I lost everything?" Dean met his eyes. "Because what you lost was an entrance, not a direction." Took a breath. "And because you haven't seen the door yet." That afternoon, Dean hosted something no studio sanctioned. A gathering, not a rally. Not a press conference. A room. He invited writers, lighting assistants, junior producers, overlooked actors, veteran crew members. He did not curate for influence. He curated for proximity to the problem, to the work, to the silence. The invitations were quiet. The location private. The purpose unbranded. They came uncertain. They left rearranged. Dean did not speak first. He listened. 2 stories of public humiliations turned into career warnings. 2 contracts quietly rewritten. 2 difficult labels applied like permanent ink. 2 moments when people had felt the same tightening Ethan had felt and swallowed it. When he did speak, it was not to promise protection. It was to remove isolation. Systems don't fear anger, he told them. They know how to frame it. They know how to exhaust it. What they fear is recognition. When people realize their experience is not personal, it's patterned. A woman in casting began to cry. A stage manager stared at the floor. A young writer said quietly, "If this is true, then we don't need permission." Dean nodded. "No," he said. "You need alignment." By the end of the night, something had taken shape without being named. Not a movement, an infrastructure. People exchanged numbers, roles, resources, legal contacts. Production skills. Quiet commitments. Someone offered space. Someone offered funding. Someone offered anonymity. Someone offered visibility. Dean watched it happen, not like a leader, but like a witness to ignition. 3 days later, a mid-budget film lost to department heads. The next week, a television project announced a change in production leadership, citing internal reevaluation. A respected director posted a public note. "I won't participate in environments that require strategic blindness." A streaming platform quietly expressed interest in artist-driven collaboration models. And then, unexpectedly, the pivot. A studio competitor, smaller, ambitious, tired of orbiting power, announced a new imprint. Artist-governed, transparency-bound, ethics, abetted. They named it after nothing political. They named it after something dangerous, standard within hours. People were speculating who stood behind it by evening. Dean Martin confirmed he did. "Not as owner, as guarantor. I'm not building a refuge." said in a brief, measured statement. I'm backing a place where speaking plainly is not considered a liability. Response was immediate and divided. Some called it reckless. Some called it overdue. Some called it career suicide. But young professionals began sending resumes not to studios but to an idea, and the industry, for the first time in a long while, felt something it did not control. Options late that night. Clara Reyes called again. They didn't think you'd go this way, she said. They thought you'd negotiate. Dean looked out at the dark city, lights like signals waiting to be interpreted. They offered me a quieter version of myself, he said. I declined. There was a pause. You've shifted the board, Clara said. Not the pieces. The board. Dean closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment, he understood what was coming, not retaliation, competition, because nothing threatens an old system more than a new one that doesn't need it. And the next phase would not be about punishment, it would be about proving which future could actually hold people. Perfect. Now we move into the final act, where pressure resolves into legacy. Suspense gives way to consequence. And Dean Martin's choice becomes something far bigger than a moment. This is the most emotional and powerful section. It's written to deliver closure, inspiration, and a career-changing payoff, while staying fully aligned with Motivational, YouTube's safe storytelling. Dean Martin was pressured to stay quiet. What he said changed careers. Part 4. The words that outlived the ROM. The first real test of the new future did not come from a studio. It came from a failure. 3 weeks after the announcement of the artist-governed imprint, the first project meant to symbolize change collapsed before it ever rolled a camera. A director walked out over creative differences. Funding hesitated. Schedules fractured. The press smelled instability and leaned in. Articles began appearing that used familiar language in a new context. Idealism meets reality. Structure matters. Talent without hierarchy. The implication was gentle but persistent. That Dean Martin had proven a point but not a solution. Dean read those pieces quietly, not to argue with them, but to locate where hope was being framed as Navit inside the new offices. An old production space repurposed with more windows than walls, the mood was not celebratory. It was careful. People who had arrived hungry were now learning what hunger actually cost. Systems, even humane ones, still needed bones, process, endurance. Someone had to make the calls when consensus ran out. Ethan worked there now, not as an actor, as an assistant producer. He had been offered 2 small roles since his dismissal. He had declined them both, not out of pride, out of clarity. He wanted to understand the room before he stood in it again. Dean watched him one evening sorting schedules that kept unraveling. Harder than speaking up, Dean said. Ethan smiled thinly. Harder than I thought courage would be, Dean nodded. That's because courage is loud. Responsibility is patient. The real storm arrived on a Thursday. A major studio announced a sweeping initiative on workplace dignity, complete with panels, committees, and a glossy press rollout. It named values. It promised listening. It included several figures who had quietly contributed to the very climate now being rebranded. The timing was not accidental. The message was not subtle. Change would now be managed. The following morning, an investigative outlet released a story that did not accuse, but contextualized. It traced how internal complaints historically disappeared into process, how task forces functioned as delay mechanisms, how cultural reform was often announced precisely when informal reform became inconvenient. At the center of the article was a quote Dean had given weeks earlier and forgotten. Silence isn't empty, he had said. It's curated. The line traveled. It appeared on talk shows, in op-eds, on walls in pencil and marker. It unsettled because it didn't attack behavior. It named design, and design could be questioned by midweek. Something rare began happening. People were leaving, not being fired. Leaving a Respected production manager resigned from a flagship show and joined a small, unproven project under the new imprint. 2 casting directors followed. A lighting director walked out of a long-term contract and took a pay cut to work in an environment where meetings were recorded and authority was documented. These were not radicals. They were architects, and architects did not move without measuring the ground. The industry's confidence wavered, not because Dean Martin was louder, but because he was no longer alone. Then came the night that would not be forgettable, eh? Televised awards gala, Don had been informed. He would no longer be presenting. Scheduling conflicts, they said. He smiled and wished them well. He attended anyway, not in protest, in presence. Halfway through the ceremony, an unexpected name was announced. Ethan Reyes. Not for acting, for producing. A short documentary created by the new imprint assembled in borrowed rooms. Funded by redirected salaries, edited by people who worked after midnight, had been nominated. The film was simple. It followed 6 crew members from different departments, telling the truth of their days. No music, no villain, no arc, just language that had never been archived. The room shifted when Ethan's name echoed, not with applause, with recognition. People understood what this nomination meant. The camera found Dean. He did not react. He watched. Ethan stood slowly, visibly steadying himself, then made his way to the stage. He did not thank institutions. He thanked moments. A month ago, he said, voice clear, I lost a contract. And I thought that meant I lost my future. What I lost was permission to pretend. And what I gained was work that didn't ask me to disappear inside it. He paused. This film exists because someone refused to make silence sound professional. The camera cut again. Dean lowered his eyes. The film did not win. It did something rarer. It moved the conversation by morning. Applications to the new imprint had tripled. 2 independent distributors requested meetings. A university announced a partnership for transparent production standards. And a senior executive from one of the oldest studios in the city quietly asked for lunch. They met without assistance, without announcements, without positioning. The man spoke carefully. You've created a parallel structure, he said. And parallel structures don't threaten the center. They replace it. Dean stirred his coffee. I didn't create it, he said. I just stopped protecting the gap. Executive studied him. What would it take, he asked, for you to speak at our annual leadership summit? Dean met his eyes. I already did. The man hesitated. Not like that. Dean's voice was gentle. Then it wouldn't be speaking. The weeks that followed were not revolutionary. They were gravitational. Budgets shifted. Policies were rewritten. Reporting lines changed. Not everywhere. Not all at once, but visibly. The new imprint did not become dominant. It became viable, and viability changes behavior faster than morality ever has. Months later, on a quiet afternoon, Dean returned to the small East Side club. The young woman from weeks before was there. Again, she sang, this time without stopping. After her set, she saw him and smiled. I didn't freeze, she said. Dean nodded. No, he replied. You arrived. They sat. She asked him if he had known when he spoke that morning on the platform. What it would become, Dean thought for a long moment. No, he said. I knew what it would cost. She frowned. Why pay it? Dean looked around the small room, the cables, the scuffed floor, the people whose voices had not yet been filtered. Because some rooms change when someone raises their voice, he said. But careers change when someone raises a standard. He stood to leave. At the door, she said, They're calling what you did a turning point. Dean smiled, soft and almost private. No, he said. Turning points turn back. This was a line. Outside, the city moved the way it always had. Inside it, something had been measured. Not by outrage, by clarity. Dean Martin had been pressured to stay quiet. What he said did not end careers. It ended arrangements, and from the space they left behind. Voices entered that had never been invited before. not louder, truer, and that. More than anything is what power has never learned how to silence. If you want, next I can write a high CTR YouTube title, multiple versions. Create a policy-safe YouTube description plus hashtags plus tags, give you short emotional thumbnail hook lines, design a short cinematic thumbnail image prompt, or build a retention-optimized intro hook for the video. Just tell me.